He cut down a tree to start construction, but what he found inside made him forget about the house. See how it all ended. Subscribe, and write in the comments which city you are from. When Thomas Gray turned 45, his life seemed to collapse in slow motion. His marriage had fallen apart after years of quiet distance. His children had grown and drifted toward their own lives, and the suburban home that once held family laughter had been sold, divided, erased. The days in the city felt hollow, a repetition of tasks without meaning. One evening, while scrolling through property listings, he came across a photograph that stopped him. The image of an overgrown field with the ruins of an old foundation and a massive tree stump in its center. It was far from the city, miles away from anyone he knew. The caption read simply, "Rural lot for sale. Unmaintained." Something about the forgotten stillness of the place drew him in. He drove there the next weekend. The road narrowed as it left the highway, becoming little more than a dirt track between overgrown hedges. When he finally arrived, the late afternoon sun was fading behind the hills, bathing the land in amber light. The field was uneven, covered with tall grass and stubborn weeds. In the middle stood the stump, the remains of what must have been a giant oak. It was so large that Thomas could have stretched his arms wide and still not touched both sides. Its surface was coarse and scarred, like the hide of some ancient creature. The edges were blackened, perhaps from a long-ago fire. He walked around it slowly, pressing a hand against the rough bark that had long stopped living. It felt solid, cold, and strangely alive under his palm. The real estate agent, a tired man in a beige jacket, leaned on the fence and said, "They say no one could ever pull that stump out. Machines broke down trying. Some things just belong to the ground, you know." He smiled as if it were a harmless story. But Thomas noticed how the man avoided looking directly at the stump. Thomas bought the land a week later. It was cheap, almost suspiciously so, but he didn't care. For him, it was not just a piece of earth. It was a chance to begin again. He told himself he'd build a small house there, maybe plant a garden, and fill his days with quiet labor instead of memories. Yet as he stood on the land the first night after signing the papers, watching fog roll across the grass, he couldn't shake the feeling that something beneath his feet was waiting. He started clearing the lot in early spring. The work was slow, honest, and exhausting. He cut away brambles, lifted broken bricks from the ground, and piled rusted nails and warped boards near the fence. The soil was heavy, smelling of wet clay and age. Birds called from somewhere deep in the nearby woods. He found peace in the rhythm of work, in the sound of the shovel against earth. But the stump remained. It sat at the heart of the field, like a monument, massive and unmoving. Its roots spread in every direction, bulging from the soil like veins beneath thick skin. Every plan he made for the new house had to be drawn around it, as though the dead tree refused to be forgotten. After a week of adjusting designs, Thomas decided it had to go. The neighbors were few, mostly older people who had lived there long enough to remember what the place used to be. They greeted him politely when he passed, but never lingered. One afternoon he stopped at the small general store near the crossroads, and a gray-haired man behind the counter squinted at him. "You're the one who bought the Mears place?" the man asked. Thomas nodded. "That's right." The man's eyes narrowed. "You plan to build?" "That's the idea," Thomas said, trying to sound casual. "Then don't touch that stump," the old man muttered, turning away. "Let it be. It's fed enough ghosts." The words sounded absurd, but the man's tone made Thomas uneasy. He laughed it off, though, buying a pack of nails and a bottle of water before heading back to his truck. Ghosts, he thought. people will say anything to give shape to old fears. Still, that night, as he stood by the stump, he wondered what the man had meant by fed. Later that week, at the small tavern in town, he overheard fragments of conversation about his land. Two men at the bar spoke quietly, unaware that Thomas was listening. One said, "That tree saw the end of Harold Mears himself. They never found him, only ashes and roots." The other shook his head. "His wife, too. House burned down after he vanished. Folks said the ground there wasn't clean." Thomas pretended not to hear, but the words stuck in his mind as he drove home, under a moon that hung low and red over the hills. He told himself stories were nothing, just rural superstition. Every town had its myths, and he had come here precisely to escape the irrational noise of people. Yet, as he parked the truck and looked out across the empty land, the stump loomed larger in the moonlight than he remembered, casting a long shadow across the grass. The next morning he decided to act. He fetched his chainsaw from the shed, filled it with fuel, and checked the chain. The air was cold, the kind of morning when breath hangs visible. He put on his gloves, squared his shoulders, and started the saw. The roar of the engine broke the silence like a sudden heartbeat. The blade bit into the wood. The smell of resin and old earth filled the air. It was harder than he expected, the wood dense and fibrous, resisting every cut. He pressed harder, sweat gathering at his temples despite the chill. Splinters flew, the saw groaned, and still the stump barely yielded. He stopped to catch his breath, wiping sawdust from his face. The silence that followed felt almost too deep, as if the land were listening. Then he heard it, a metallic ring beneath the blade, faint but unmistakable. He shut off the saw and leaned closer. The cut he'd made revealed not just wood, but something darker, something that caught the light. He tapped it with the tip of the saw and heard it again, the dull echo of metal under the grain. A strange thrill ran through him, a spark of curiosity and unease. What could be buried inside a tree? He imagined old tools, perhaps a piece of fencing swallowed by growth. But this was deep within the heart of the stump. It didn't make sense. He crouched, brushing away dust, but could see only a sliver of dull gray. He decided to leave the rest for tomorrow. The daylight was fading fast, and the hum of insects rose from the grass as evening crept in. He cleaned the saw, placed it in the shed, and walked back to the small trailer he used as temporary shelter. When he looked out the window, the stump stood in the gathering darkness, its silhouette sharp against the dimming sky. That night he couldn't sleep. The image of the metal glint kept returning, pulling his thoughts in circles. At some point he drifted into an uneasy doze, only to wake with the impression of a noise outside, a faint cracking, like something shifting underground. He listened, holding his breath. Nothing but the sigh of the wind. Still, he thought he heard something else beneath it, a slow creaking sound, deep and deliberate, as if roots were moving. The following morning, gray clouds hung low over the land. Mist curled around the edges of the field. Thomas stood before the stump again, this time studying it closely. The texture of the bark seemed different, the color deeper, almost bruised. He touched the place where the saw had struck metal. It was cool and unyielding, but he noticed something else. Faint traces of rust on the edge of the cut. He felt a shiver despite the warmth of his jacket. What was buried here? Why had no one else tried to find out? He remembered the stories, the whispers, the warning in the old man's voice. Don't touch that stump. But now that he had, he couldn't stop. Curiosity was stronger than caution. He would dig tomorrow, he decided. Not with machines, just with his hands and a shovel. If there was something under there, an old relic, a box, a clue to the land's strange silence, he wanted to see it himself. That night, as rain began to fall softly against the trailer's roof, Thomas dreamed of roots spreading through the earth like veins, wrapping themselves around something hard and cold. In his dream, he was beneath them, watching from the dark as they coiled tighter. When he woke, his heart was pounding, his palms damp with sweat. The air inside the trailer was thick with the smell of wet soil that shouldn't have been there. Outside, dawn was breaking. Mist drifted low, and the stump stood where it always had, patient and immense. Yet for the first time, Thomas thought he saw a faint shimmer where he had cut the day before, as if something beneath the wood had begun to breathe. He turned away quickly, telling himself it was a trick of light. But deep down, he knew tomorrow would not be about building a house anymore. It would be about uncovering what the earth refused to let go. And somewhere far beneath that gnarled mass of roots, the metal waited. The rain did not stop through the night, and by morning, the soil around the stump had turned to thick, dark mud. The air was cool and heavy, the kind of silence that seems to hold its breath. Thomas stepped out of the trailer in his boots, shovel in hand, determined to dig until he understood what lay beneath. He told himself this was only curiosity, nothing more, but something inside him, something he could not name, felt compelled. The discovery of metal inside a tree that had stood for generations had lodged in his thoughts like a splinter. He had lain awake for hours listening to the rhythmic patter of rain and imagining what the earth was keeping from him. The first shovel of dirt was wet and cold, and as he dug deeper, the smell of earth thickened, rich and almost metallic. Roots wound everywhere, thick as his wrist, twisting through the ground in ways that seemed unnatural, their direction spiraling rather than branching. He cut them carefully, one by one, setting them aside. Each one bled sap that looked too dark, almost the color of dried blood. He tried to ignore the thought and kept going. The ground around him sagged slightly, as if the hole itself resisted being opened. After 2 hours, he had gone deep enough that his boots were half buried in sludge. The edge of the shovel struck something hard. He knelt down and brushed away the mud with his gloved hand. Beneath the layer of roots was a patch of corroded metal, flat and square, unmistakably man-made. His pulse quickened. The shape was too precise to be a natural object. He cleared around it and saw what looked like the outline of a box, its corners eaten by rust. It was large, about the size of an old trunk, wedged tightly among the roots. They held it like the fingers of a giant hand. He had to use his saw again, cutting through the smaller roots, the air filling with the scent of damp wood and gasoline. When the final one snapped, the box shifted slightly, groaning as if reluctant to be freed. By midday, the rain had stopped, but clouds hung low, trapping the field in a dim, diffused light. Thomas wrapped his arms around the box and heaved, feeling the muscles in his back strain. It came loose with a wet, sucking sound and landed beside the hole with a heavy thud. He sat there, panting, staring at it. The iron was mottled and orange with rust, its hinges barely visible beneath grime. There was no lock anymore, just a corroded latch that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. He hesitated before opening it, the weight of history pressing against his chest. It occurred to him that this box had been hidden since before he was born, that it had been buried with purpose. But curiosity was stronger than fear. He pried the latch open with the handle of his shovel. The lid gave way slowly, screeching as rust flaked off and fell to the ground. Inside, wrapped in rotting cloth, were bundles of paper. He peeled one back, revealing old banknotes. US dollars, yellowed and fragile, marked with dates from the 1940s. Beneath them gleamed something dull and heavy, gold bars, small but unmistakable, stacked like bricks. His breath caught in his throat. There was more, a pile of legal documents, stamped and sealed, and in the middle of it all, an envelope sealed with wax. The seal was broken, but still bore the impression of a letter M. Thomas lifted the envelope carefully. The paper crackled, almost disintegrating in his hands. Inside was a single sheet of folded parchment, written in faded ink. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, precise. The first words made his heart race. To my son, if you ever find this. He read on, his lips moving silently. The letter was signed Evelyn Mears. She wrote of fear and regret, of gold that was meant to buy safety during a time of war, but had instead brought ruin. Your father thought he could hide the sin beneath the roots, she wrote. He said the earth would keep secrets better than people. But I feel it still, growing through the house like veins. If you read this, promise me you will let the tree stand, for it alone remembers what he did. When he finished reading, Thomas sat in silence, the wind whispering through the field. The story seemed impossible, yet it explained the unease that had followed him since he first stepped onto this land. He looked at the gold again. It was real, tangible, gleaming faintly in the gray light. It represented wealth beyond anything he had known, and yet he felt no joy. The air around him felt charged, as if the ground itself disapproved of what he had done. He carried the box into his trailer, setting it on the table beside his tools. The interior smelled faintly of old paper and decay. He turned the letter over, looking for more, and noticed faint stains near the bottom of the page, brownish, circular, like dried drops of something darker than ink. He rubbed his thumb across them, but they didn't smear. For a long time, he sat staring at the box, thinking about the people who had buried it. That evening, he drove to the nearest town. The library was small, but its local history section was surprisingly well organized. A few old newspaper clippings confirmed what he had begun to suspect. In 1943, Harold Mears, a local businessman, had vanished along with a significant amount of gold belonging to a mining company under government contract. His disappearance was followed by the mysterious fire that destroyed his home. His wife, Evelyn, was never seen again. The article mentioned rumors that he had hidden the gold somewhere on his property before he died. The investigation was inconclusive. The land was later sold for taxes. Thomas left the library just before closing, the streets wet and glistening from drizzle. He felt a chill crawl down his back as he realized that the field he now called home was the same place where the Mears family had vanished. When he returned to the trailer, night had fallen. He switched on the small lamp above the table, its light casting long shadows across the walls. The box sat where he had left it, silent, ancient, and waiting. He reread Evelyn's letter several times. The phrasing haunted him. The earth keeps secrets better than people. There was something almost alive in that idea, as if the tree and the soil were participants in whatever had happened here. He told himself that he would take the gold to the authorities the next morning, but he didn't move it. He couldn't. The more he looked at it, the heavier it seemed, as though it was drawing him in. The night deepened. The air grew still. He tried to sleep, but the creak of the trailer and the occasional tapping against the windows kept him awake. Around midnight, he heard another sound. Soft, deliberate, like scraping beneath the floor. At first he thought it was a mouse, but the rhythm was too slow, too measured. It came from directly under the table where the box rested. He froze, listening. The sound stopped, replaced by silence so complete that he could hear the blood rushing in his ears. The next morning, the ground outside looked disturbed again. The rain had smoothed most of it, but near the stump the soil had sunk slightly, forming a shallow depression. Thomas stood there for a long time, shovel in hand, staring at the spot. Part of him wanted to fill it back up, to pretend he had never found anything. Another part, the part that had driven him to dig in the first place, demanded he go deeper. He chose the latter. He worked all afternoon, following the roots downward. They were thicker now, interwoven like muscles beneath skin. Sometimes he thought he saw shapes in the soil stones that looked like bones, shadows that moved when he wasn't looking directly at them. His arms trembled from the effort, but he didn't stop. The deeper he went, the stronger the scent became. Damp, iron, faintly sweet. When his shovel struck something again, the sound was softer this time. Not metal, but wood. He cleared the dirt away with his hands and found the remains of a rotted plank, possibly part of a box or a coffin. The realization made him dizzy. He stumbled backward, catching his breath. The wind picked up, rustling through the tall grass. The sky darkened prematurely, and thunder rolled far off beyond the hills. Thomas climbed out of the hole, mud covering his boots and arms, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. He looked at the field, at the stump that had started it all, and for the first time he saw it not as an obstacle, but as a grave marker. That night he dreamed of a woman standing beneath the oak, her hands folded, her face pale and sorrowful. She whispered something he could almost understand. Let it rest. When he woke, his hands were dirty, his fingernails packed with soil. He told himself he must have sleepwalked, but the tracks in the mud outside the trailer showed only one pair of footprints coming from the hole, not going toward it. Days passed. Thomas grew withdrawn, consumed by the mystery. He tried to distract himself by working on the cabin's foundation, but his eyes kept drifting toward the stump. He thought about the gold sitting in his trailer, about Evelyn's warning, about the blood-stained letter. He wondered if she had buried her husband there, or if someone else had done it for her. He began to believe that the tree had grown over something, or someone, that could no longer be hidden. One evening he stood beside the stump again, watching the sun dip below the hills. The shadows of the roots stretched long and thin, curling toward his boots like dark fingers. He could smell the earth's breath, cool and faintly sour. He remembered the first time he had touched the wood. It had been cold then, but now it felt warmer, almost pulsing beneath his palm. He knew he had gone too far to stop. Whatever waited below had claimed him as surely as it had claimed the Mears family decades ago. When he turned back toward the trailer, the box inside seemed to gleam through the window, reflecting the dying light of the day. He told himself he would end it tomorrow. He would dig until there was nothing left to find. But as he lay in bed, unable to sleep, he realized something strange. The sound beneath the floorboards was no longer faint. It was breathing. And somewhere deep under the roots, the earth exhaled. The night after Thomas decided to end it once and for all was a sleepless one. The air hung heavy and strange, carrying the smell of rain and iron, and every creak of the trailer made him flinch. He had left the box of gold and papers on the table, untouched since the day before, but the thought of it filled the small space with tension. It wasn't just the weight of the metal that haunted him. It was what it represented, the echo of something buried long before he arrived. By dawn, when the first gray light seeped through the curtains, Thomas was already outside, shovel in hand, facing the place where the ground had sunk again near the stump. He no longer cared about explanations. He wanted the truth, no matter what it looked like. Mist crawled along the field as he began to dig. The sound of the shovel cutting into wet soil was steady, almost rhythmic. He worked without rest, his muscles burning, the cold air filling his lungs like smoke. The roots tangled around the blade as if fighting him, their texture more sinewy than wood should be. Once or twice, he thought he saw movement shadows slipping between the folds of earth, but when he blinked, there was nothing. The hole deepened until he was waist-high, surrounded by the smell of rot and something faintly sweet, like decay mixed with sap. When the shovel struck something solid, the sound was dull, almost soft, as if it had hit cloth instead of stone. He knelt down and brushed the dirt away with his hands. For a long moment he didn't understand what he was seeing. Then, as the soil fell away, he saw the curve of a skull, pale and brittle, half consumed by roots. They had grown through the bone, weaving in and out like veins reclaiming flesh. His stomach twisted. He sat back, mud soaking through his clothes, staring in disbelief. This wasn't just a grave. It was a prison of roots, as though the tree itself had pulled the dead into its heart. He climbed out of the pit, trembling, and stood at its edge. The morning sun broke weakly through the clouds, casting thin beams of light across the field. The stump stood silent, unmoved, its surface scarred and black. For the first time since he had come to this place, Thomas felt afraid, not of ghosts or legends, but of the living weight of the earth itself. What had Evelyn Mears meant when she said the tree remembered? Was this what she had buried? He stumbled toward the trailer and grabbed his phone. His hands shook as he dialed, but his voice steadied when he spoke to the dispatcher. He reported what he had found, gave the address, and hung up. The minutes that followed felt endless. He sat on the steps, covered in mud, watching the wind ripple through the grass. It was almost peaceful, except for the faint pulse of dread that seemed to hum beneath his feet. When the police arrived, a pair of local officers followed by a county investigator, Thomas felt both relief and shame. The officers moved cautiously, their boots squelching in the wet ground. They peered into the hole, exchanging quiet looks. One of them called it in, and soon after, more vehicles arrived, the air filling with the low rumble of engines. Men in gloves and uniforms took over the site, setting up a perimeter with yellow tape that fluttered in the wind. Thomas answered their questions numbly. He told them about finding the metal box, about the gold and the letters, about the sound of metal inside the stump. He tried to explain that he hadn't meant to uncover a grave, that he only wanted to build a home. The investigator, a tall man with a weary expression, listened carefully, but said little. When Thomas finished, the man simply nodded. "We'll take care of it from here," he said. "You should get some rest." But Thomas couldn't rest. He stayed nearby as the forensic team dug deeper, uncovering more bones. They found the rest of the skeleton, twisted among the roots, its position suggesting struggle. One of the officers murmured something about the size of the skull matching the old missing persons report. Thomas didn't need to hear the rest. He already knew it was Harold Mears. The realization made him feel sick. The soil that had promised him peace now felt poisoned, and the house he had dreamed of building there seemed like a desecration. As the day passed, more details emerged. The documents from the box confirmed Harold's connection to the stolen gold. The letter, now in the hands of the investigators, hinted at guilt and violence, though it was too vague to name what really happened. Late in the afternoon, one of the officers approached Thomas with something wrapped in plastic. "They found this," he said. Inside was another piece of paper, brittle and folded many times over. It had been pressed against the inside of the box, stuck to the metal by years of moisture. The handwriting was the same, Evelyn Mears. Thomas read it slowly. The words were faded, but the message was clear. He would not stop. The money had become his god. I tried to reason with him, but greed deafened him. I buried what he loved most, so that the earth could take him back. I planted the tree to mark his shame. If you find this, don't unearth us again. Let him stay where his roots took hold. The letter ended without a signature, only a small ink blot where her name might have been. The words struck him harder than he expected. They were not just a confession, they were an invocation, a plea to the future. Thomas realized that Evelyn had chosen to bury her husband, and perhaps herself, under that tree, so that the secret would die with them. The oak had fed on their silence for decades, growing strong on their guilt. He wondered if the gold had ever truly been meant for anyone to find. By sunset, the police packed up. They told him the site would be treated as a historical investigation, that specialists from the state would arrive in the coming days. They took the gold, the documents, and both letters for examination. Thomas stood at the edge of the pit, watching as they covered it with a tarp. The wind had shifted. It smelled of rain again, but also of something clean, as if the land itself exhaled after holding its secret for so long. He spent the night inside the trailer, sitting by the window. Without the box on the table, the air felt lighter, but emptier too. He thought about leaving, selling the land, and starting somewhere new, but a part of him couldn't. He felt bound to it now, as if by uncovering the truth he had inherited the burden of remembering. He dozed off near dawn and dreamed again of Evelyn standing beneath the tree, her eyes gentle this time, her voice a whisper of forgiveness. Weeks passed. The investigators finished their work, and the authorities eventually returned the land to him. They told him that the remains would be buried properly, that the site might even be designated a local landmark. Thomas listened, nodded, and said little. When they left, he walked the perimeter of the field. The grass had already begun to grow over the disturbed soil, erasing the traces of what had happened. Only the stump remained, a dark monument to everything that had been hidden and found. He began to rebuild slowly. The act of working steadied him. He poured a new foundation near the far edge of the property, away from the stump, and framed the walls himself. Each strike of the hammer was a small act of defiance against the fear that still lingered. Some nights, he thought he heard faint creaking from the direction of the stump, but it no longer frightened him. He told himself it was just the wind, though a part of him always listened a little longer, as if expecting the earth to speak. By the time summer arrived, the house stood finished small, simple, built with his own hands. He moved in with only a few possessions, his tools, a chair, a shelf of books, and the letter the police had let him keep after making copies. He framed it in glass and hung it near the window. It was a reminder not of fear, but of the danger of forgetting. Some nights he read it again, the faded ink barely visible in the moonlight, and thought about how greed could root itself so deep that even death could not bury it completely. Then, one morning, as he was tending the yard, he noticed something new. A small shoot had broken through the soil near the old stump, a slender sapling, its leaves pale green, trembling in the breeze. Thomas knelt beside it, touching the fragile stem. The bark was smooth, the color of ash, and though it was only a few inches tall, it looked impossibly alive. For a long while he stayed there, watching it sway. He thought about tearing it out, afraid it would grow into the same monstrous oak that had once held so much sorrow. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. Instead, he stood, brushed the dirt from his hands, and said softly, "You can stay." Days turned into weeks, and the sapling grew. Its roots took hold quickly, its leaves darkened, and soon it cast a small circle of shade beside the ruin of the stump. Sometimes, when Thomas sat on the porch in the evening, he would see the tree's shadow stretch toward the house, long and delicate, and he would feel a strange peace settle over him. The land was no longer silent. It breathed again, free of its secret. One night, after a summer storm, Thomas stood at the window watching the rain slide down the glass. The new tree swayed gently, its leaves glistening under flashes of lightning. He thought he heard something in the wind, a faint voice, or maybe only the memory of one. It wasn't words this time, just a tone, soft and low, carrying neither sorrow nor warning. It sounded like release. He went outside, barefoot, the earth cool beneath his feet. The air smelled of wet grass and distant thunder. He placed a hand on the young tree's trunk. It was warm, pulsing faintly under his palm, and for the first time he understood what Evelyn's final words had meant. The past could be buried, but life would always find a way to rise again. The roots might remember, but they no longer held him. When morning came, the sky was clear. The field shone with dew, and the air was filled with the quiet hum of insects. Thomas brewed coffee and sat on the steps, looking out over the land. The hole was gone, the police tape long removed, the soil smooth and green. The sapling's leaves stirred in the light breeze, and he smiled. He no longer dreamed of the woman beneath the tree. He no longer heard the breathing beneath the floor. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt earned. Somewhere beneath the earth, the past rested its roots deep, its secrets finally still. And above, the living world began again. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more. Watch the next video, and don't forget to share this one with someone who loves powerful stories.